I had quite a long discussion here I was going to do today because it's a monumental issue in front of us, but a lot of it's been covered already by the senator from District H over the ownership of our resources, our Constitution, and how we're different from Texas and North Dakota and Louisiana and all other states in the Union. And then the chairman of the Finance Committee dealing with the budget numbers. And clearly they are undisputable. We can argue about a little bit of the margins, but we are in a financial position that is fairly grave. But we can see now that we're starting to turn the corner to get out of this. And as we look forward, Mr. President, on how we're going to deal with the future in front of us, which I think is very bright, and we look at this ownership asset that we pooled up, the permanent fund, which is in 57 billion, thereabouts in that range, and who owns it. Clearly, as spoken on the floor today, it's the citizens of Alaska that own it. But it's more than that. There were citizens that are no longer here, our forefathers that have passed away, that have left that value in front of us today. And our job, in my opinion, is that we leave that for the future generations. We have many grandparents on the floor, parents. We have generations that go back 10,000 years here on the floor. Some of us go back just in Southeast, in my family, 115 years. We've seen booms and busts in the fur trade. We've seen it in the fisheries. We've seen it in timber. This is nothing unusual. So as we go forward and we look at how we're going to preserve this asset and how we're not going to consume it, and I repeat that, not going to consume it for us today, us being here in the next decade. We were very fortunate over the last 35 years to live through this immense oil boom. And this wealth has built the state to an unprecedented level that our forefathers didn't even dream about. And it's unconscionable for us to even consider, in my opinion, raiding the permanent fund and diminishing its future ability to produce wealth for generations to come after us, long after these forecasted fields that have been discussed today are pumped dry, that we haven't even got hooked to the pipeline yet. So as we look forward to how we're going to do this and how we're going to get out of this fiscal hole of several billion dollars, and we look at what our previous generations have done to help Alaska, it wasn't what, as John Kennedy said, what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's very similar here today, except we're dealing with the state. So as we look forward and we look around and we look at the structure of the permanent fund, there's other structures and other ways of dealing with things. And clearly this structure was put together many years ago and frankly needs to be updated. And if we look around to other communities, other endowments, other asset pools, we can use a couple of examples. Fairbanks has a permanent fund that pays out 1% of market value at 4.5%. Mental Health Trust has a similar type structure in that range. But I want to talk in a little bit more detail how the community, one of the communities I represent, Sitka, pulled itself through the closure of its pulp mill and a loss of 1/3 of its economic base. It's not much different than what Ketchikan did with their loss of their mill or Wrangell in their sawmill. We have, in my generation, seen the implosion of that industry. So Sitka did not take its, for them, a fairly large pool, its wealth in cash that we got from scrounging nickels and dimes. We did not squander it on the community over a period of 5 or 6 years when we lost that pulp mill. We actually looked forward and converted the Sitka Permanent Fund to 1% of market value. We did that in the late 90s. It took several years to work through City Hall and the Assembly. Structured it, put in a payout of 6% a year, which I think everybody would agree is high. At that time, 6% of the market value The community needed a revenue source to keep its taxes down, keep its economics viable, versus the future generational needs. So that was set at that rate, and it's gone forward at that rate since then, over 20-some years. We've seen a slight erosion of purchasing power. The bond market's changed over the years. Stock markets go up and down. And we've, in that instance, just like the Alaska Permanent Fund went through the dot-com blow-up at 2000, went through the 07, 08, 09 financial debacle and the Great Recession. But what the community did do is not liquidate that portfolio and take it away from future generations. That portfolio produces that income every year to keep our taxes down and help the community run. That is not too dissimilar to what's on the floor here today, looking to all Alaskans to pitch together to help fix this problem. It's not something that we on this floor can fix ourselves. We in the legislature and even the executive branch. We need everybody in the state to pull together and chip in to help. But it's very, very critical that we don't ruin and hurt future generations, their purchasing power on that portfolio, and we don't consume it, like I mentioned earlier, not only through the wealth bubble, but on the backside of it, give them empty oil fields. So in looking at how we're going to restructure and how we're going to get out of this hole, there hasn't been much discussion here today on the size of it, but I haven't seen any mathematical models that show how we can get out of it without the help of the permanent fund, versus a complete demolition of our agencies. And those that don't want Fish and Game, don't want the Department of Natural Resources, don't want to educate your children, that might be a solution they like. I would argue, Mr. President, that is a very small segment of Alaskans. We want to educate our kids, give them a better opportunity than we had, and set them forward in life for their time when they're standing here on the floor of the Senate and they're looking back, trying to hand off Alaska in a better position than they got it from us. So when we look at restructuring this permanent fund, we've got a couple of issues that we need to pay particular attention towards as we look at this bill, that we don't come out of this restructuring and have the permanent fund set in a position that doesn't maximize itself. And so let me talk about that a little bit. Currently, I think the wolves are at the door, the financial wolves. Their tongues are hanging out and they're right outside those double doors, ready to devour their earnings reserve account. Now, those watching at home, the earnings reserve is not the constitutionally protected portion of the permanent fund, but it's sizable. 15 billion, 14 billion, that's a large sum of money. We can take that out in a simple majority vote with the signature of the executive branch and spend it on whatever we want to spend it on. That would, in fact, every dollar we take out of there and do that with diminishes the future generations of Alaskans all the way to the end for perpetuity. Their value that they're getting out of the permanent fund is going to get diminished from that action. I'm very concerned, Mr. President, that if we don't do something to protect this permanent fund, that's exactly what's going to happen. There are bills in the works, discussions amongst ourselves to take billions out of the earnings reserve. And to me, that is a fire alarm issue. That is the wolves at the door devouring this wealth portfolio. So by doing or setting up a structure that would protect that ability, if we set it up as a percent of market value, and we did it as a percentage of last year's value, we would get a lot of fluctuations to deal with the budget cycles that would be just, you don't want to pull your hair out. We need to smooth that out so the Department of Revenue and the finance committees understand what revenue they have to set their budgets. We do that by backing up 6 years, taking the back 5 of that 6 years, total it up, the end of the value of every year, divide it by 5. It's just that simple. Take end of June's number, 5 years, divide by 5. 8th grade mathematics. We want to be very transparent with the public, so there's absolutely no doubt that what is going to happen with their portfolio and their money and their value that they have to give off to their future generations of their family. Once we have that value set, then comes the debate that's on the floor, and we'll be going forward the next couple months in this building. What percentage should you pull off of that? Obviously, is that we set that amount in the policy, and I've mentioned here a few minutes ago, 6% over the last 20-some years in Sitka is too high. So what is it? There's two kind of basic philosophies going on here from what I can see. One would be let's maximize the value of that portfolio for the state to consume, the general fund to consume. The other one that I support is that permanent fund should be set up, irregardless of our financial situation, to run independently. It should structure its asset allocation, its risk level, look at its rate of return, that it could generate, target, take into account the inflation mechanism, and then have a residual amount that can be spent. Again, regardless if we're a $2 billion deficit, if we're in $3 billion or $2 billion surplus, that permanent fund should be pushed into an area that is ring-fenced, protected from us, the political machine, so we don't put undue pressure on its risk exposure to try to drive it to produce too much income, create too much risk, and hurt the portfolio in the long run through bear markets, implosion of value, or milk it like a cow, because those assets, again, belong to more than just us. So when we look at that, the rate that they're looking at for inflation, again, this is the asset allocation that's presently exists, gives a target return of about 6.9%, a little under 7. You got a 2.5% inflation in that built in, and then an expected return of 4.7. So if we take out a payout that's less than 4.7, or right at 4.7, 4.75, 4.7, 4.6, I like 4.5. It gives a more conservative position to the permanent fund. And in doing so, then obviously we have a bigger hole to fill. So if we go out several years, I'd like to see us in that range, Mr. President. I don't want to see us at 5.25. I don't want to see us at 5. I want that protected for future generations, including all the Stedmans that are coming after me. So then, if you take out that payout, and say it is 5.25, our problem would be gone. Our deficit problem would be gone if we took it all into the general fund, but that is not what the bill says. But if we did do that and had zero dividend, our fiscal problem would go away. We'd have a whole other set of social issues and other problems that would surface with the electorate because they have definite ownership, unlike all other states. On the flip side, if we took it all to dividends, we can't make our payroll. A year from July 1, we shut down, and we don't shut down because we're off a little bit. We shut down because we can't make payroll. Economic game's over. Nobody runs a state like that. Nobody runs a country like that. It's just one of those mathematical exercises. So it's somewhere in between 0 in the dividend and 100%. Right now we're talking about bringing the dividend down on the split. And just for the record, I like 50-50, whatever payout it is. I'd like to see it in the end a fair split between the citizens and the state. But we can't get out of the hole at 50-50 today. The hole is too big, the financial hole. We need the people of Alaska to pull together, help us fix the problem. Let us bring that dividend in that range of $1,000, carry it forward for 3 years, and use those funds into the general fund to meet our obligations so we can continue to look at budget reductions, and possibly revenue enhancements so we can get to a balanced budget. Because once we set this in place, we're going to see what the structural deficit is. And it's going to be a chunk, and we're going to have to solve that. So, Mr. President, I think that's very, very critical that we don't strain the permanent fund. And I recognize in this environment, to get out of this hole, we might have to put a little pressure on it more than I'd like to see. That is unfortunate. But I'd also like to add, if we would have acted earlier, as referenced, and I'm talking collectively, referenced earlier tonight or this afternoon, we've spent $10 billion out of our savings account outside of the permanent fund. $10 billion. At the rate we're burning our cash, we're going to do this year's budget out of the Constitutional Budget Reserve. There'll be a couple billion left that the administration is going to need to run the state and have a cushion if we have a natural catastrophe or unforeseen event. We can't even do next year's budget without the permanent fund's help, in my opinion. So let me jump back a little bit and talk about dividends, because I think it's a very important component of sharing the wealth between the state, general fund, and the citizens. Because this is not Texas. We don't have the rich farmer or the rich rancher owning everything under the ground. But if we go back to 1983, as referenced earlier by the senator from Kodiak, he was talking about the dividend in 84, but if we go back just to the very first dividend, pretty close to the same value, $386 in 1983, that would be worth $920 today. That's the power of inflation. If you go back to the original $1,000 dividend in 1982, that would have been $2,474 today. So we need to not lose sight of the power of inflation to erode our wealth and the eighth wonder of the world, and compounding interest. I'll give you another example. 1993, every citizen got $949, and I'm rounding it off to pennies. At the end of 16, because that's the last year, I've got the inflation numbers calendar. It would have been worth, that $949 would have went to $1,572, $1,572. If we go to year 2000, when we got a $1,964 dividend, today that's worth $2,725. I think the citizens of the state need to be very cognizant of the effects of freezing the dividend over a long period of time. It is devastating to their wealth. It might feed our spending appetites in Juneau, but it's only fair that the dividend available for distributions to the public be tied into the value of the portfolio, not some arbitrary amount that looks fair today, that inflation will erode tomorrow, so our grandkids get chump change. And we end up, the political machine and the operation machine in Juneau, end up with the vast majority of that wealth coming out of the ground. So I thought I'd kind of put that in a little bit of context, Mr. President. Also, for those watching at home, over the past 35 years, we've paid out $40,000 in dividends, $40,121.41. 40,000 bucks. That doesn't count the extra resource dividend at $1,200, and it does take into account the $1,022 dividend we got this year. 40,000 bucks. We should all be proud of that. I'd like to see that number continue to go up over time, but what we really need to do, Mr. President, is to make sure we're open and transparent in how we restructure the permanent fund. We make it very clear that the citizens are going to have a dividend. I would like to see, we ask them in the future for a constitutional amendment to close out whatever amount above that payout percentage is. If it ends up at 5, 4 3/4, 4, whatever it is, or 4 1/2, whatever that is, through the political process, that we do not have access, we, the appropriators, we, the wolves at the door, cannot access anything more than that in any given year without a vote of the people. Because it scares me financially to hear some of the conversations in this building about how easy it is for us to go in and take billions out of the earnings reserve. It's easier than imposing taxes. It's easier than some of these cuts that we might have to talk about. It's the course of least resistance, Mr. President. So this is just a step forward. And when we make this step, we need to make sure that we continue the commitment to the public that we're going to respect their ownership rights of the vast wealth Alaska has. We're going to ensure that not only they, but their kids and their future generations and their family are going to receive that dividend. And we, as the policymakers, are going to have a strict set limit on how much can come out of that portfolio. And if I could just add a little bit, because I forgot a little thing I wanted to mention, Mr. President, as I go on about how much monies the dividends may be, or how much can come into the general fund. When we isolate the permanent fund, it should be purely by happenstance how much comes out to us once we set that payout rate. And if it's set at 5, 5 1/4, 4 1/2, 4 3/4, whatever that final number is, if that portfolio was double that it was today, say by some reason it was twice as valuable, we'd get twice as much cash to run the state and twice as much dividend. If it was half as much, if it was 25 billion, 26 billion, we'd get half of that. The permanent fund shouldn't be the milk cow that we go to. Let it run like it has in the past without political influence. Let it produce the income it can produce. If we want a bigger value of that portfolio, then let us go extract more oil, let us cut more timber, let us catch more fish, let's build up the economy, and let that feed the next generation. But let's not eat the corn seed of our kids because we've had the good fortune for 35 years to ride the economic boom, and we don't want to make the tough decision to pass this wealth on. So that, Mr. President, I look forward to the passage of this bill and a few tweaks along the way so we can get full public support for it. And let's go forward and hand off a brighter Alaska than what we received in the 50s or the early 60s from our forefathers.